So I did this presentation last year for Gaia Sphere,
Hmm.
and also presented it at Contact in the Desert as a workshop. It starts with the maps of Antarctica, which I'll show quite a few maps that were created not years, not decades, but centuries before Antarctica was discovered in 1820 by sealers and whalers. Then I'm going to go into the polygonal architecture and megaliths around the world, which really does make the case for a high-tech civilization being on this planet a long, long time ago, as well as the maps, which sometimes even had in the liner notes that they were created off of source maps dating back to the Library of Alexandria. And finally, I'm going to go underwater and show you some underwater archaeology. If it wasn't
Yeah.
absolutely clear that there was lost civilizations on this planet, I posed the question, how do you create megalithic buildings underwater? I don't know if
Mm,
that's possible.
yeah.
So
Yeah. Okay, let's do it.
presentations have been very well received at several of these conferences that I gave it at, and I'm more than honored to give it here today.
Thank you,
Go
brother.
through Earth history. Yeah.
We're we're ready to receive. It's all yours.
All right. Excellent. So let me just see here then about sharing my screen. Here it is, early mapping in the builder race. And we're going to go full screen here. And we will see keynote. Play. Okay. Are you guys seeing that on your end?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, great. All right. So, shot of camping in Antarctica. I didn't do that. I went down on a sailboat, and this is basically the area on the upper left, the Palmer Peninsula, where I visited for 26-day sailboat trip. And that was almost exactly 5 years ago. We went out in January 2019. Gosh, what a year 2019 was, huh? Little did we know at the beginning of the year what the latter part of the year would have in store. But what I'm going to show are the pre-Diluvian maps of Antarctica and the curious polygonal architecture underwater ruins around the world, starting with these maps during the Age of Discovery, show the world exploration, a knowledge of the physical boundaries of the planet. In some cases, even with mapping highlights that are still being discovered to this day. Some of the islands in a couple of those bays of Antarctica, you can see on the map on the left, which is a map that came out just before my trip down there about 6 years ago. And this was showing where parts of Antarctica are warming up in red, including where I was visiting in the northern tip of the Palmer Peninsula. And indeed, there was ample signs that the weather was changing, weather patterns were changing. But what's so remarkable, Mother Nature, in her infinite wisdom, has also cooled down parts of Antarctica. What you're looking at in the 2 miles deep of the polar plateau of Antarctica is the largest amount of fresh water on the planet. If this continent were ever to melt and Antarctica would flow into the sea, then you would have catastrophic sea level rises. But in her infinite wisdom, Mother Nature has balanced it out. And that's why you have places like Miami Beach or Santa Cruz, California, where I was a year ago, still just right at sea level. All right, let's jump into it. I am a cartographer myself. I draw maps for several of my books, the Sacred Places series of books. And it's always that with cartography, you read a map. Yes, there are words on the map. Yes, there is different aspects of a map in which we interpret the landmass. So cartography is one of the oldest professions, and it was a profession because in the age of discovery, first thing any pirate would do when they captured a ship is get into the captain's lockbox and steal their maps. And oftentimes these maps were copied hand over fist. So just a little bit more about Antarctica, because it is such a different, weird world down there. You have 1,350 active volcanoes worldwide, but 1/3 of them erupting some point in recorded history. The reason I'm bringing up volcanoes is because Antarctica is the most volcanically active continent in the world. And indeed, just like off of the big island of Hawaii, the Lohi Seamount is an underwater volcano that is rising to the surface. You have a lot of volcanism activity in Antarctica, which has the propensity to create new lands. So here's one of my favorite maps of Nazi Germany showing New Schwabenland and a trench that went right through the mid-Atlantic ridge into Antarctica. And the Nazis chose this area because of the geothermal activity. And in fact, um, there are areas in New Schwabenland, which you can see on the top of the map of Antarctica there, the German claim, that never freeze. They're called Antarctic oases. And in those Antarctic oases, the geothermal activity is able to heat up the land so that it never freezes and never accumulates the ice, which is so common. So this is the Germans going down there in the late 1930s. Um, and this is where I was in a section off of the Palmer Peninsula. And when I was touring the Palmer base, only because I'm an American and two other people I were with were Americans. We're 11 Poles and 3 Americans on our ship. We were able to go into the Palmer station base. Normally, they don't want tour boats or cruise ships to come aboard, but I kept insisting, I'm an American taxpayer. You got to let me come. I want to see Palmer Base. And when I was in there, we were getting tour of the facility. And when we were in the galley, our guide, the manager of the base, said, take a picture of that picture on the upper left. So I did. And he said, I'll show you why when we go outside. And when we went outside, he said, take a picture and look out there. You see that island on the lower right is called Pie Island. And only a few years before we got there, the ice bridge connecting Pie Island to Anvers Island melted and broke off, revealing for the first time that there was this island out there. And if you see the painting on the upper left, this was done in mid 1980s. They didn't even know it existed right there across from the Palmer base. So my point here is to show that there are new land masses now coming into view, whereas only a few short decades ago, they were still covered in ice. And we'll see how important that is when we get to the Piri Reis and other maps, which depict islands under the ice shelves that could still possibly hold new landforms that have yet to be discovered. And so some of those landforms are coming up from volcanoes, as you say. But considering that these islands were only exposed before the last ice age, the Piri Reis map is likely drawn from a source map 17 to 12,000 years ago, making the case for it to be antediluvian. And the very famous book by Charles Hapgood, who is the author of Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, evidence of advanced civilization in the ice, mainly concerns itself with the Piri Reis map, which you can see on the cover there. It does contain several of the other maps I'm going to show you here in a minute, but the Piri Reis map is just incredible. Here it is in its entirety. The original map was drawn in 1513 from a source map much older. And it says so right there in the liner notes on the lower left-hand side, where it says that there are 20 maps and charts referenced in these notations. 8 were from the Ptolemaic age, maps of the known world according to Hellenistic or Greek culture in the 4th century AD. But there's even reference to the maps being much older, those source maps in which Admiral Piri Reis drew this famous map from. Here you can clearly see the outline of South America and some of the data points. And this super civilization that would have existed over 4,000 years ago would have been congruent with ancient Egypt. It's now known that the ancient Egyptians were incredible mariners, making their way to the land of Punt, where they would excavate gold and other minerals. In the tomb of King Tut was found a boomerang, the same kind of boomerang that was used and still used by Australian Aboriginals. The only 2 places in the world where boomerangs have been found are in the Tomb of Pharaohs and in Australia. So the Piri Reis map depicts Antarctica not having ice. Maybe a very large comet of ice hit Antarctica and basically pulled the ice and snow right off the top of that large landmass. But that would never explain how it got ice and snow so fast. Because clearly, in the time of Piri Reis, Antarctica was very similar to what it is now, because the polar plateau of Antarctica, it takes many, many years, centuries, even millennia to accumulate even a quarter mile of ice. So that polar plateau of Antarctica has been around for a very long time. So cited in the notes, this map is a known copy of a much older original, and it even makes reference to the Library of Alexandria, which of course was in Alexandria, Egypt, and burned down quite infamously, losing so much precious printed knowledge that's now gone. But these maps, of the source map that the Piri Reis map was drawn from, were mapped thousands of years before Columbus. In fact, Columbus is even referenced in here too, as he was going across the Atlantic only 21 years before the Piri Reis map was drawn to what would be the Caribbean Sea. This is where Columbus landed. He never saw South America, he never saw North America, and to his dying day, Christopher Columbus thought that he had discovered the islands off of India. And that's why we uh, misidentify the Native American Indians of North America as Indians, like they're from East India. And that's why the West Indies, that chain of island off to the right of Puerto Rico, is also called the West Indies and misidentified. So on the Piri Reis map, this was done before the Mercator projection. Now I'll explain how that was so absolutely revolutionary for map making, when you can account for the global projection on in a 3-dimensional way. So this map, this Piri Reis map, is very much a 2-dimensional map. And They got some of it right in the Caribbean. I think that big blob that's over the Yucatan in Mexico is probably supposed to be Cuba. If you kind of just shift some of these islands over to the right and up a little bit, it is a pretty accurate map, as you can see with the outline of Central America and the north part of South America. Pretty close. But of course, the real mind blower is how accurate the African and South American coasts are. So the Piri Reis map accurately depicts the Iberian Peninsula and the West African coasts. I find this really cute, all the exotic animals he inserted in there, as well as the sultanates. Because just remember around the year 1492, when Columbus made his first voyage, they had just gotten all of the Arabs, known as the Moors, out of Spain. It was all around the same time, but there were still sultanates in Africa, and Africa to this day is still Muslim country. But those exotic animals, you can see an ostrich, an elephant, and several other smaller creatures in there that are kind of interesting. Flipping over to South America, the appended notes here say the map of the Western lands drawn by Columbus. And there are four other source documents were Portuguese and one was Arabic depicting Antarctica. So he's getting these source maps from all these different avenues, including the Portuguese and other Arab map makers who knew about Antarctica. Okay, just remind you, this is in the early 14th century, 1513, when the map was drawn. And here is how the Piri Reis map depicts Antarctica. So if we were using the Mercator projection, the methodology not used by other cartographers until the 16th century. So interesting how it could depict islands that are deep under the ice and are only now being discovered, such as Pie Island that I showed earlier. If we were to look at Antarctica without the ice, you can see some of those islands in the Ross Bay that are depicted on the Piri Reis map. So let me just flip back, but keep an eye on the bay there and then the Palmer Peninsula. The Palmer Peninsula extending up to the left. And in the middle of the bay, you see that large island. And then here in the map where it's completely covered with a glacial ice shelf is a very large island, even somewhat similar in shape and size to the one depicted in the Piri Reis map. So you don't even have the first mariners setting foot on continental landmass of Antarctica until after they read Captain James Cook's account of circumnavigating the Southern Ocean in a map I will show you in a moment. And he wrote in his diary that got published about how rich the seas were in seal and whale life. And that inspired merchant marines to come down to seek their fortune by hunting these mammals of the ocean and nearly wiping some of them out to extinction. Here's another view of what Antarctica would look like without ice on it. And these are the source map of the Piri Reis, as I mentioned, has other source maps from pre-Hellenic times. So before Christ, or possibly as early as the last ice age. Before the Great Freeze came over, if there was mariners who got down there, perhaps they were viewing Antarctica when it had far less ice on it before the last ice age began. So that could be 17 to 12,000 years ago. So let's just take a little journey through some of these earliest maps. The Martin Walls Mueller world map from 1507 is the first map to depict the entire Western Hemisphere. So now you have a map maker going against Christopher Columbus's view that he had discovered the islands off of India. And on the Waldus Mueller map, you have the very first reference of America. So if you see the blow up on the lower right, that's where the entire North and South America and Central America got its name. Where is that located? Way down in southern Patagonia. That was the original naming of America. Actually, it was just the signature of Amerigo Vespucci, who was also a explorer and cartographer, who just put his signature on this map. And because this particular map started to show the New World, it had become a very prized item and often copied. So look at this in 1507, and this is just less than a decade before the Piri Reis map. You're starting to get a pretty good idea of all the world's land masses, including, if you look below Africa, around south of Madagascar, you can see some southern continents and how South America joins to a southern continent. And that's exactly what Magellan thought when he discovered the Straits of Magellan. So on the left here is a real map of how South America looks flipped upside down, and how Magellan drew his map showing the Straits of Magellan that got passage to the Pacific Ocean. Um, Other similarities, such as Rio de la Plata, that's where where Buenos Aires is, and on the other side of that is Uruguay and colonial Sacramento, a really cool colonial town that I ended my trip at 5 years ago, including Puerto San Julian, where I took this picture of the map, right where they have an exact replica of the ship that made it all the way around the world. Although Magellan was killed on Mactan Island in the Philippines, his historian, Pigafetta, who I give a presentation about the giants, and also my megaliths and mysteries of South America presentation, were twice the size of the European mariners. And where they first encountered the Patagonian giants was at Puerto San Julian, depicted on this map, where Magellan came over with 5 ships, and there was a mutiny. Some of the ships' captains wanted to go back, and indeed 2 of them did. One of Magellan's ships sank off of the coast of Patagonia. 2 of them made it through and carried on around the world. Another ship was lost in, I think it was the Philippines, and only one ship, about 24 men of the original several hundred that went on the 5 ship, made it all the way around the world, including the historian Pigafetta. And that's how we know the story of Magellan's journey so well. But all the while, in many of these early maps, after knowledge of the Magellan Strait had made it more into the mainstream, and you could tell how many of these other early maps show the Strait of Magellan, even name it as such, but also depict a southern continent. And while Magellan was sure that Terra del Fuego led to this larger continent, some of these other map makers also reflected that as well. And again, here is the map of showing the home distance So now this is 6-8. Still think that Terra del Fuego connects to Terra Australis Incognita. That was always the historic name for the southern continent, hypothesized to be down there since the time of the ancient Greeks, who actually, where the name comes from, named it the opposite of Arctos. Arctos is a constellation in the northern hemisphere near the North Star. And so the ancient Greeks prophesized there had to be a southern continental landmass having knowledge of the continents on Earth and called it the Anti-Arctos or Antarctica. But in Latin, it was Terra Australis Incognita. Terra Incognita means the unknown lands. They named it Australis. And then when Australia, the continent, was discovered, it got the name. And that was well before the discovery of Antarctica. And then it got the default name of the ancient Greeks. So now here you see some of the giants of Patagonia confronting a European. Look at how little they were, really half the size, twice as big were the Patagonian giants, and even has a little notation about them on that map. Again, Terra del Fuego, which is an island at the southernmost tip of South America, is depicted as connecting to this larger landmass. And even the Chinese, who quite possibly got to America on the West Coast 70 years before Columbus. In 1421, this map was created, a pretty accurate depiction of all the continents of the world, including Antarctica. So even the ancient Chinese had knowledge that it was down there. So this mystery continent that's so shrouded in, well, covered in ice, really cannot support and never did support a human population, nor are there any land animals. The biggest animal that lives on land is a little insect that big. And most of the life in the Southern Ocean is underwater with marine mammals such as whales and many varieties of seals, the penguins, of course, and ice fish that can only live in freezing water. They have just adapted and thrived in this inhospitable environment. So the Mercator world map of 1569 is very revolutionary because it now shows the whole globe, the whole planet, in a three-dimensional projection. In fact, the globes that we have today are still based on the Mercator projection. How you're now looking at a world map as two globes, the northern and southern hemisphere on one side, the Western hemisphere, you could say, and the Eastern hemisphere on the other side. And there is Antarctica again, never seems to go away, but it still hasn't been discovered. In fact, it would still take several centuries before it was discovered. Here's another interesting map. The Boche map depicts a passage underneath the ice. And one of those earlier maps I showed of Antarctica without the ice, indeed, there could be a way to go between Western Antarctica and Eastern Antarctica right below the ice. And so now at this point, you see the Drake Passage being discovered by Sir Francis Drake. I'll show the way that he discovered that. And now Terra del Fuego is its own island. And now you also see Australia taking form, as well as Tasmania, which was discovered by Abel Tasman, a Dutch mariner who gave it its naming rights. But they didn't discover Antarctica yet. Not yet. The Finne map is also another interesting one. because it shows approximately what Antarctica looks like at the end of the winter season when the sea ice is making its way out. And it's a much bigger version, but isn't this map interesting, showing the world from the top down and the bottom up? So when I was in Australia, there was a great map called Up, Over, Down, Under, as we call Australia Down Under. And it just flips the map. And you look at the whole world map upside down, but it's not incorrect. It's just the way that you view that map. Just in the same way, viewing this map from the top of the Arctic Circle or from the bottom of the South Pole are accurate descriptions of those land masses. Now, here's a blow up of the Finney map, and it's still called Terra Australis, meaning the land that lies to the south, the Latin name for it, always prophesizing that this continental landmass was down there, but nobody had seen it. So that's kind of interesting. I think I might have flipped the slide first. I did. Yeah, and again, as I said, the Finney map, when put over the ice sheets and some of the glaciers, is a pretty fairly accurate depiction of that continent. Now, here's the route that Sir Francis Drake took. He was best known for the first British mariner to sail around the world. He made it through Magellan Strait. They got into the Pacific Ocean and were met with a storm. And his ship, the Golden Hind, got blown back into the Atlantic via the Drake Passage. And his cartographers, map makers, and navigators told him, well, we're back in the Atlantic. And rather than going through the Magellan Strait again, they just waited for the storm to lessen and then went around Cape Horn, which is the very bottom of South America, and then made their way around the world as well, citing several places along the way. I do believe that Sir Francis Drake is the true founder of the Bay Area. And in my discussions with Scott Walter from Unearthing America, America Underground, America Unearthed, is that that I lived in San Francisco for many years, and I said that not only was there an artifact that was etched in steel with writing, they were claiming New Albion is the name, another name for England, calling California New Albion. You still see that name, place names all around the Bay Area. And had that claim stuck, and this is why I think the historians choose to deny Drake as being founder of the Bay Area, Britain might be able to make claim to the west coast of the US. So instead of giving him the honor of discovering San Francisco Bay Area, they said, no, he just went up to Point Reyes, and there's not even a good bay at all, let alone spending several months there and trading with the Indians who would have told him about the bay. And if it were just one day without fog, they would have seen right through the Golden Gate and known that one of the best harbors on the entire west coast of the Americas was there. So he found it. He surely did. But because they didn't want to give the Brits the privilege of claiming this land, that was taken away from him. So you can see he eventually made it all the way around the world. They were plundering Spanish galleons, and Drake's first trip was hugely successful.